everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. In her book, Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias, Strategies for Healing the Root Causes of Inequity in Education, Dr. Claudine Kizart implores educators, especially K-12 teachers, to take a deep, introspective look at personal perceptions, attitudes, and biases that might keep them from delivering educational equity for all students. Up next on Another View, a frank discussion about bias in education and strategies to create equity in the classroom. And we pay tribute to a brilliant jurist and public servant, the Honorable Jerrauld C. Jones. Another View is coming up next after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. We'll talk with educator and author Dr. Claudine Kizart about her new book, Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias, Strategies for Healing the Root Causes of Inequity in Education, in just a moment. But first, we pay tribute to a gentle giant in our community. The Honorable Judge Jerrauld C. Jones died on May 31st. He served Hampton Roads and Virginia well as an attorney, legislator, champion of justice, and judge, and he was a personal friend. Another View producer Lisa Godley shares his story.
The Honorable Jerrauld C. Jones is being remembered as a civil rights pioneer. Throughout his life, this Norfolk native was a trailblazer. In 1961, he was one of the first black students to integrate Ingleside Elementary School. He would later attend the Virginia Episcopal School in Lynchburg and go on to graduate from Princeton University in 1976. He would earn his law degree from the Washington and Lee University School of Law. Jerrauld Jones was the first black law clerk to the Supreme Court of Virginia and served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates for 14 years. He was appointed by Governor Mark Warner to the position of Director of the Department of Juvenile Justice, where he served for 3 years. He would later serve as a judge on both the Juvenile and Domestic Relations District Court, as well as the Circuit Court. Judge Jones never hesitated to share his thoughts and experience with our Another View audience. One example was in July of 2013, after George Zimmerman was found not guilty in the death of Trayvon Martin. Another View tackled the question, where do we go from here? Barbara asked Judge Jones to share his thoughts on the best ways to turn things around for young African-American men who often find the deck stacked against them.
You know, you hear the statistics of not graduating from high school, getting involved with the justice system at early ages, not being able to be successful fathers and parents. Where do we start to try to turn this around?
Well, the problem by the numbers is very daunting. There's no question about that. It's disappointing. It's depressing. There is disproportionality of racial minority contact at every point of the juvenile and criminal justice system. So, I mean, if you look at the numbers, you could be overwhelmed, and the experiences that those of us who are involved in the criminal/judicial system will tell you that if you really look into those situations, it always somehow comes back to the family. It comes back to, I'm not necessarily talking about the traditional family, I'm just talking about that loving, caring, involved adult and significant family kind of structure, and it can be non-traditional. When that is present, then the likelihood that there will be a poorer life outcome is diminished. And when it's present, we are always looking for better outcomes, and they generally occur. So the short answer is, where do we start? We start child by child. We take it one child at a time. We take it one family at a time. We take it one neighborhood, if you will, at a time. And we make a difference there. Be that significant, caring adult, responsible, take some responsibility for someone else in their lives, and that's how you ultimately will make a difference, and it will replicate and grow exponentially.
Jerrauld Jones served on the board of directors for the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, on the board of AMI Kids and as chair of the Virginia Commission on Youth. He is survived by his wife, the Honorable Lynn Simmons, who serves on the Norfolk Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court, their son Jay Jones, a former Virginia House of Delegates member, his wife Mavis, and 2 grandsons, Charles and Zachary. Judge Jones' commitment to serving the Commonwealth of Virginia and the citizens of Norfolk will not be forgotten. Jerrauld Jones was 70 years old.
And on behalf of the Another View crew, we extend our deepest condolences to the Jones family. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Ask a Black person over the age of 50 who had aspirations of going to college after high school, and it's likely they will tell you a similar story, that their teacher or guidance counselor steered them away from college and encouraged trade school or the military. And sadly, as I talk with parents and students today, it's still happening. Be it implicit or explicit, educational bias affects all students, and our guest today has some strategies for educators to help them overcome educational inequity. Please welcome to Another View Dr. Claudine Kizart, author of Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias, Strategies for Healing the Root Causes of Inequity in Education. How are you, Dr. Kizart?
I am amazing, and thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad to hear that you're here. And pull your mic up a little bit so we can make sure we can hear you well.
All right, how about
that?
There
you go.
Awesome.
That is great. So before we even get started, because I can hear people in the audience, I can feel it. They're going, they're talking about bias. They're talking about, words that we shouldn't say anymore. This is not about the blame game.
No, absolutely not.
What is this? What is it about?
So, bias is Dr. Beverly Tatum said that biases are like smog. It's in the air. We all have bias in some shape, form, or fashion. This is about love. Love is an action. My mother always told us that love is a verb, it's an action. And when you love students and when you love education and when you love humanity, you want to make sure that you are doing a good job and that you are putting that love in action. And part of that is learning about yourself and giving yourself grace, giving ourselves grace. The fact of the matter is we all have preferences. And that's what a bias is. It's a preference, right? Those preferences are not right, wrong, or indifferent. It's just that when we're operating in collective space with each other and those preferences rub up against each other and impact one another, that's when we need to say, okay, how is this preference possibly harming a student? Or how is this preference possibly harming the way that we're doing business? Looking at biases I'm hoping that this book will help it be a natural thing that we do in a way that's not so intimidating or fearful. It's just, how do I as an educator, how do I as a person be a better person? And part of that is understanding who I am and understanding what biases I have and how those biases show up in my work and in community.
So when people are talking about words like diversity, equity, inclusion, bias, et cetera, the first thing they do is attach it to race.
No.
Bias. And so educational bias.
Yeah.
Does that mean it is attached solely, singularly to race?
No. When I was in St. Louis, and hello to anyone who's from St. Louis out there, I led a presentation that was focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond race. Because unfortunately, you're correct. And people are correct in thinking that biases are often assigned to race and race only. And if you look at the amount of books that are on equity and that are on diversity and that are on inclusions, oftentimes there's a racial lens to them, and mainly because race is something you can see. Right? And so it's the easiest thing to point out when we're talking about differences because you can see it. But biases number one, have been studied for hundreds of years, right? So really it's not a function of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Some of the biases that I talk about in my book have been studied and researched since the 1800s, right? Wow. And so to attach it to just say this is just about race is just inaccurate.
So name some of the other ways in which bias can show up.
Oh my goodness.
So what else is it attached to?
So it shows up in the way that we treat people with disabilities. It shows up in the way that we think and treat people who may from different demographics in terms of where they're from. I remember I was a dancer at some point, and there's probably a little bit of dancer still in me. But I was in this African dance company, and I learned that there is a difference in the way that some people from the continent of Africa think and feel about the people who are African American. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about people who look alike, who have the same hue.
So it's intra as well as externally.
Who have the same hue, but who have those biases, and those biases show up in the way that we treat each other. Mm-hmm. Biases show up in, how we operate in business and how we operate in schools when we're afraid that we might lose something, whether it's time. In my book, I talk about scarcity bias.
Yeah, and we're going to get into those specifics in just a little bit. But I really want to make our audience comfortable in understanding where we're going with this. Now, you teach workshops and you work with organizations nationwide. Yes. So we are not talking about any specific school division or whatever. But what is it about educational bias that is important enough for you to sit down and write this book?
Well, for me, I've been an educator for 26 years. Mm-hmm. This is my 26th year in education. Wow. I first started in a special education classroom, and I started in special education when special education was still in the basement, right? And this was back in 2004, 2000. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, this was a little bit before 2004. Mm-hmm. And I was part of, as a special education teacher at the time, I was also part of the push to be inclusive. And so we took our students from the basement and did push them
into mainstream
classes. And there were challenges on both ends. There were challenges with our students who had certain disabilities and students who didn't have certain disabilities or weren't labeled with disabilities, and how they interacted with each other, as well as the teachers. I had an opportunity to serve as a literacy and equity trainer for the state of Missouri. And I did a lot of observing. That was part of what I did. I went in, and my job was to really get a sense of the data and then do some observations, get some quantitative data on why we were seeing these achievement gaps, right? Mm-hmm. So even before we said equity gaps, we called them achievement gaps. If you have this middle school down the street from another middle school, why are there students in 7th grade over here excelling in areas that the students in 7th grade over here are not? It's the same district. Mm-hmm. What's going on in both of those schools? And oftentimes it was how they were being taught, right? And what curriculums, this one school was using, and what programming and curriculum the other school may or not have been using.
So what's the difference between equity and equality?
Oh, one of my favorite subjects. During the civil rights movement, the focus was on equality. Right. Mm-hmm. The thing even about the civil rights movement is it wasn't just for people of African descent. It wasn't just for Black Americans. The civil rights movement impacted everybody. Native Americans, mm-hmm. Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, African. It impacted everyone. Mm-hmm. The problem, there's a TED Talk on the danger of a single story, right? The danger of just boxing the civil rights movement into just being about race is that some people started thinking this is just about black and white. No, this was about humanity, right? And our ability to be civil and collaborate and work together. So of course, because at that time there was huge segregation. Part of the issue of civil rights was that I couldn't drink this bottle of water in this office, or I could, or there was probably a store I couldn't even go in to buy this bottle of water, right? And so that was not equal. I can't even go in the door to get it. So the civil rights movement opened up the way for people to be able to go in the door and go in the store.
So provide an equal opportunity for everyone.
Absolutely.
But that's not an equitable opportunity.
No. So I often say where we are, and I know you're probably going to look at me a little cuckoo. I think that where we are is where we should be. Okay. And I say that because it's only been about 58 years since the civil rights movement. I don't think we're not at 60 yet. Right. And so what we had to do was learn how to even open the door for each other and with each other. And now it's like, okay, now that legally everyone can come into the store, how do we make sure that everyone is being treated fairly in the store? Legally, now that everyone can go to the school district, the school in their district, how do we make sure that we are being fair in the way that we're teaching and in the way that we're communicating and in our decision making? Those are two totally different things, but one is contingent on the other.
So how do you convince a teacher or an administrator or someone that is dealing with students within a school district that if they consider their bias and if they examine their bias, that they are not a bad person?
Sometimes we have to say it. Sometimes we have to say it. And in my book, I lead with that. I lead with giving ourselves grace. That this is not about being smacked upside the head or being shamed or giving ourselves grace. Actually, learning about your bias is one of the best things that you can do for your students and for your school community, because then you can see, how am I showing up in my school community? How am I making decisions that impact my school community? That's love, and that's being a quality educator, irrespective of what your positionality is in education.
All right, let's talk about some specifics then, because I want to get some examples so that people really understand what we're talking about. So you talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect bias.
Yes.
What is that? And give us an example of how it shows up.
So Dunning-Kruger is a bias that first was studied in 1999 by two French psychologists. And I'm going to read the textbook definition for each of the biases, because I know your readers. I'm one of your listeners. I know us. We go look, right? We research, we study, right? And so I'm going to read the textbook definitions for them all. So Dunning-Kruger effect is a bias that is characterized by having excessively favorable views of one's abilities, both social and intellectual domains, acting as if we know more than we do.
Okay. So give us an example how that might show up in the classroom.
So, for example, and if it's okay with you, I want to give the example from an administrative lens,
that's
okay? Because often, when I did the research, I often saw this happening really at the administrative level, right? Particularly among principals, superintendents, instructional coaches, because there is this idea that you have to know. If you're the school leader, then you have to know everything. You have to know everything, right? But the reality is, there's no way humanly possible that we can all know everything. And so sometimes so an example, say you're in a professional development session, and this is something I talk about in this chapter, where you're looking at achievement gaps or equity gaps, right? And the superintendent may say, well, we don't have issues here. Well, but your data is saying that you do, and that you have students in this school district in the same school and in the same district in the different classrooms that are learning differently and something is not happening to connect with that so that both groups of students are successful. A person who has a challenge with Dunning-Kruger effect might dismiss that information and blame it on the students.
So they would say, I know better, and it's the student's fault that they're not learning.
It's the student's fault. And then may even go further, well, this should have been learned at home. And while some things, yes, should be learned at home, if it's your job to ensure that all of your students are learning and all of your students have access to an opportunity to learn, then that means you need to take a look back. Is that happening in my district? And if not, what do we need to do differently?
So how does that then translate? I mean, is it up to you as an individual to figure out that you need to take a bias check yourself, or is it incumbent upon other people to say to you, you need to take a bias check?
It's both.
In other words, how do you start to evaluate that within yourself if you already believe that you know it all?
So it's both and.
Okay.
It's often helpful to have people on your team who do not think like you. That's where that synergy and innovation comes from, right? When everyone is in the room that is, they think the same and they, have the same type of lens, it's difficult to have that creativity. So you want people in the room who are saying, hey, your slip is showing. Hey, that was a little bit biased, right? And then hopefully you have an administrator that is open, to saying, well, how so? That leans in. Well, how so? Right? Because we talk about education being a lifelong process. That means that as educators, we have to continue to learn. The other thing is, in my book, I also have a checklist. So a person can get the book and read each chapter. It's designed to be very interactive and take themselves through the checklist. And in the checklist, it's asking questions like, do you often feel like you need to have all the answers all the time?
So so there are some things that you can talk to yourself about to kind of check where you're coming from. So what happens when you say, okay, this is an issue for me? How do I then correct it? What do I need to do?
So then we go to the strategy section.
Just talk to me, girl. What's the strategy?
So if you, after going through the checklist, right, of whether you are a person that lives in the house of Dunning-Kruger bias, right, then there are strategies, right? And one of the strategies is, number one, give yourself credit or the proverbial pat on the back for knowing what you do know.
So acknowledge that you do. There's nothing wrong with you having knowledge and understanding. Gotcha.
Absolutely. And then remember that expanding your knowledge is a good example for students and the people that you are leading, right? Another thing is joining and staying engaged with professional learning communities, specifically those that are geared towards your role as an educator. So constantly putting yourself on intentionally in spaces where you are intentionally learning, right?
It just strikes me so that an educator would have to be told that they need to continue to learn. Because I mean, isn't that that's the whole point of education and being an educator, is it not?
But I think that we do for the most part. But I think when it comes to subjects like biases, unfortunately, because of where we positioned conversations about biases, those sometimes can be a little uncomfortable conversations to have. But these are the conversations that we need to have, because you can have a school district that funnels money into every type of professional development and the best of curriculums possible. But if you don't manage and know how to manage your biases, then the way that you then do that work will be different and will continue to have an impact on your student achievement.
757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. What questions do you have about educational bias and how it may be showing up in your child's classroom? Give us a call and let's talk about it. And if you're just joining us, we are talking about educational bias with Dr. Claudia Claudine Kizart, author of Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias, Strategies for Healing the Root Causes of Inequity in Education, 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Let's talk about herd mentality. What is that? Herd mentality bias.
So herd mentality bias has been called different things at different times, right? Some people have called it herd mentality. Some people have called it like wheelhouse, when everybody's just kind of, you're thinking the same, birds of a feather flock together, that kind of thing. But this is actually one of the oldest biases that has been studied.
Wow.
Yeah, it was first studied in 1895.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
1895. And so again, I'll read the textbook definition, which is also in my book. It is a bias that can be broadly defined as the alignment of thoughts and behaviors of individuals in a group, following the crowd out of a false sense of belonging or a fear of being left out.
So you follow the crowd because you want to belong.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how does that manifest in a classroom?
So understanding that belongingness is a psychological and physiological need, right? It's not just it's nice, right? If you feel like you belong, it's like water, right? We all need to know that we belong. So understanding that is really important, and it shows up in the classroom through something simple like what's available in our classroom to read, right? Taking an inventory. I remember when I was in the classroom and I had some students that just they said they didn't like reading. At the time it was Miss Kizart. Miss Kizart, I don't like reading. I don't like reading. And so my question would be like, well, what do you like? Right? And at the time, the I'll be honest with you, I wasn't one of those teachers that always liked to go eat in the cafeteria with other teachers. Well, no, I would love to eat with students.
Oh, okay.
Well, part of it was, unfortunately, at that time, most of the time during lunch was when teachers would dish on students and talk about what was happening with students, both good and bad. And sometimes mostly bad. And I didn't want to use my lunchtime for that. And so I would intentionally remove myself from those conversations, because that's when you would also see that herd mentality bias happening.
So if someone started a conversation, everybody would pile on?
Absolutely. Especially if it was about a student, right? I had that student last year, and, she did this. And, I had that student when they were in kindergarten, and then they did this. And so then what we then end up having is all this documentation verbally about this one particular student, because everyone in the herd is now just talking about that student as opposed to.
So when I was reading your book, you were talking about at that time also you were a fairly new teacher, and you were not comfortable with confronting teachers about this behavior. So in a herd mentality bias scenario, then is it incumbent upon someone to step out of the herd in order to bring attention to it?
Absolutely. And
how do you
stepping
gain
out of the herd,
the confidence and the courage to do
now,
that?
I'll tell you, I am really fortunate. I have a mother and a godmother and mentors who will say, I think you need to check your thinking on that. So when I think back, I feel like I was always being put in position to write this book, right? Because at the time, I remember my godmother, Shavi, said, I really want you to think about your thinking on this, right? And why didn't you speak up? And my mother would say, I love my mother, Creole Kizart Hampton, hey mama, you are to speak truth to power. Right. And at the time, the power was the herd. Right. And so I remember when I asked the question about, there was a scenario where the teacher said, I don't think that that Spanish should be even an option for people to
have in the classroom.
In the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And she was getting a bilingual student, right? And I was like, oh my goodness. In my mind, man, I wish she wasn't getting the bilingual student. That student's probably not going to get a fair shot in that class. And there were other things that she said about the Spanish speaking community that were really, really concerning. And then when she said something, other teachers also said something, and it was more about the discuss and the concerns about having Spanish-speaking students in a school that was, of course, predominantly English-speaking. And the first time I was in the conversation, I didn't have the courage to say anything. I didn't want to be singled out. I didn't want to be the outcast. So I just stopped having lunch with them.
Yeah, but now you would do it differently.
I would absolutely do it differently. Absolutely. And at the time I didn't know how to do it differently.
Right.
And so it wasn't until I started doing the research for this book that I understood strategies.
So in the herd mentality, then, unless someone points it out to you, though, you could carry that into the classroom or in any life situation for a long time.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that was the other thing that I was going to say about these biases. Yes, this book particularly is about education, but these biases show up in businesses and nonprofits and everywhere that humans are. Yeah. Right. Yeah. My particular research was just on in education, but they show up just about anywhere.
So some strategies to get beyond the herd mentality.
One of the strategies is courage. Always checking in and making sure that your values are matching what you're doing. Yeah. Did I believe in this? Was that really what I would want to do? And if not, I also have value. The other thing, the second one, is knowing that your voice has value. That often we're in the room because we belong in the room. And so it is our job to then speak up. Some people say take up space, but to speak up and to know that you have value, that the thing that you might say may be the thing that dismantles the herd process and the herd behavior. The thing that you might say may be the thing that people say, oh, I thought about that, or thank you for bringing that up. Let's do that instead. But if we never have the courage to think different from the herd or to speak up, right, when the herd is going right and we're like, wait a minute, down there is a cliff. Instead of letting the herd go over the cliff, you say, hey, the river's this way. Yeah. Let's go this way. Somebody will hear you and say, well, maybe they're right. Right. So knowing that you have value is I know it
takes a lot of introspection.
It does.
To do this work.
It does.
Anchoring.
Oh. So when I think about anchoring bias, I think about literally an anchor, right? And if you think about what an anchor does, an anchor makes a boat stay put.
Right. Holds you in place.
It holds you in place. So the question would be, do I want to be held in place? Or do I want to grow?
I like that. I mean, that really does give you something to think about in terms of how you as a person will educate others to be so that they can continue to grow. Because if you're not growing, it's kind of hard to teach other people how to grow.
Absolutely. So I read the textbook definition: a bias involving anchoring or holding on to information we know, which is usually based on prior knowledge when making a decision. This cognitive shortcut causes us to rely solely on what we already know or to seek information that validates the thoughts and ideas to which we are anchored. So if you think about, there's a bias called confirmation bias. And when we're operating in confirmation bias, we only want information to confirm what we think.
So that's kind of like watching the same type of newscast all the time.
Yeah, I just
example.
Exactly.
I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear the other side.
Exactly. Or if I do research, and that's one of the things that I loved about getting my doctoral degree, is we had to look at information that was on both sides, right? And so it's difficult to be anchored in whatever your thought process is, because you have to look at information from both sides. So I always say that anchoring bias and confirmation biases are friends, because we are looking to confirm what we're anchored to. If I believe that, I'm going to say it, if I believe that women should just take home ec classes, or women should not be in the House of Representatives, or should not be trained to go to schools that help prepare them for politics, right? Then I'm going to show you documentation after documentation after documentation about women who succeeded in other fields, right?
Gotcha.
I'm now anchored to this information, right? And so then everything that I'm going to share with you and tell you is going to now validate what I want you to know and believe.
Sticking to that same story.
Yeah.
Okay, we got 3 more, because I want to make sure that we get through these and then talk about how they manifest in the classroom. So decision fatigue. I thought this was really interesting, because you said this was probably the biggest bias that educators face.
Absolutely. Because often educators are tired. Right. If you look at the population of educators, educators are often in the classroom, mostly women. So often there's that duty and responsibility to self and to family. And then if you have children, then you're also educating your children. And I have a sister, Camille, love her. She has 2 children, and she used to teach like preschool, kindergarten, like the younger ages. I never could understand, like, how do you deal with the wiping of the noses and things of that nature. But she's a special person in that way. Like, she's very nurturing. But I remember just she and I talking one day about the responsibilities of her in class, and the responsibilities of her being a mom, right? So some educators are just tired. And it's interesting you talk about, you asked about an example, well, for the other ones. We haven't gotten there yet for this. But originally this bias was talked about and studied in the judicial system. And there were countless studies about judges and decision making. And some of the studies, this one particular study talked about how judges tend to make different decisions in the afternoon
versus the
morning. And part of that is decision fatigue. There's all this brain research on how many quality decisions we can really make a day. And if you think about all the decisions that we make a day, sometimes the brain is just like, what's the shortest way to this? How can I not put a lot of effort in this? But if you're an educator, or if you're in a position where your responsibility is to do your due diligence for the whole, then that decision fatigue is really something we have to be mindful of.
Yeah, that one we can understand.
Yeah.
In-group. In-group bias.
In-group bias. So in-group bias is also called affinity bias, or affinity group bias. And that is a cognitive, when we think about cognitive, it's like the brain's bias. So all of this is about what's in our head. It's a cognitive bias that explains our tendency to favor a decision that supports those whom we share the same in-group, or share the same physical, cultural, religious, language, or other similarities with. Affinity or in-group bias, it's a very natural thing that can show up in the way that we hire educators. And I think about that because, to be honest with you, my very first position in higher education was because of in-group bias, but it had to do with my degree. I have a master's degree from St. Louis University, and the person who was doing my interview said, "Oh, you're an alumni of SLU." And I was like, "Yeah." Interview stopped. The rest of the information was, where do I turn my W-2s and how do I get my textbooks and things of that nature.
So the group was your connection through the university.
Absolutely. So it goes back to your original question of these biases not being like synonymous with race only. You got to think about it's attached to where we go to school, in our communities, what our religions are, what our language is, what our cultural views and values are. We in group bias in this chapter. One of the things that I love, if I can share this with listeners, is on page 105. There's a figure, and it shows the various types of in groups, right? In groups related to hobbies, sports interests, weight, nationality, age, ability, career, or field of study. And then it shows people on the out group.
And those are people who are not a part of that in crowd.
Absolutely.
And how they can be made to feel ostracized.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I could see that manifesting in the classroom as maybe more attention being paid to someone who's in your group,
absolutely,
whatever the group is that you identify with, as opposed to those who don't.
Absolutely. And again, all of these things are natural.
Yeah.
Right. And so we got to give grace to ourselves. We are tribal. People do gravitate to people who they are most like, because we're all seeking a sense of safety. And that's not wrong, but as an educator, when we and we are going to continue to have a diverse population of students, right? You can look at all the research from the Pell Institute, Brookings, Census.
And diverse is across the spectrum.
Across the board. So that one of the best things that we can do as educators is learn about our biases and how they show up, and how to manage them.
So the last one is scarcity.
Oh, scarcity bias. I'm going to read because I have so much to say about that, especially with everything that's happening in the world right now. So to center myself, I'll read the definition. A mental shortcut that occurs when we fear the loss of something valuable. Time, energy, money. That bias then colors our decision. So how that shows up in education is often, I don't have time for that. Right? When I was a teacher, when I worked in the classroom, I always had something extra for my students who finished work to do at the back of my classroom. It takes time. It takes time to do that. It does. Right. But at the time, I didn't have children. I didn't have a lot of the responsibilities that I have now. And I have a daughter, and she was sharing with me, like, she finishes her reading assignments in class really quickly. Right. And I'm like, okay, but what else do you do when you're done? Yeah. And she's like, there's really nothing else to do. Right. When I'm done. But it takes time. So I'm saying that to say, breathe, give yourself grace. In that space of scarcity bias, when we're thinking about, I don't really have time to cater to the multiple intelligences in my room, right? Then what we're saying, Shonda Rhimes, she says, if we're saying no to something, we're saying yes to something else. What we're then saying is, I'm now willingly not teaching my diverse group of students, even though I may not be consciously making that decision when I'm saying, well, I don't have time to make sure that all my students are learning, that I know the learning style of my students. Then that means we're not planning to ensure success for all of our students.
I was going to bring that up to you because I could hear an educator who has 30, 35 kids in the classroom trying to figure out how to make sure that every student has what they need equitably to be able to be successful. And I mean, that could be a lesson plan that I would think might take forever. I don't do lesson plans, so you have to tell me as a professional educator. But it sounds like that would be a lot to expect from a teacher. And there may be teachers who then say, you know what, I don't have time.
It is a way to do it that is simple. Right. So having one of the things that I used to do, and one of the things that I learned from some of my other elder teacher friends, was to have a folder in the back of the classroom. And this is extra assignments. So when you finish, and you have to set up systems, right? Systems that make your life as a teacher easier, and that helps your students and it helps your classroom to function smoother, right? And part of setting up those systems is communicating with students. Okay, listen, I know that some of you all are going to finish your work a little bit early. You don't have to, but just in case, there's a folder back here. And then what's the benefit of doing this extra work? They're gonna 5 extra points or 10 extra points, right? So then you have students who feel more comfortable, saying, hey, I finished my work a little bit earlier, because some students don't want to say, because they don't want to seem like the nerd, right? Being a nerd is cool, but not everybody thinks that being a nerd is cool. So some of it is about setting up systems in our classrooms.
So, Claudine, what is the danger of educators not paying attention to their bias?
Doing the same thing, expecting different results.
And give us an example of how that, especially for those of us who haven't been in a classroom in a long time.
Gotcha.
Give us an example of what that looks like.
So I'm thinking of one of the examples that I discuss in my book, and this was in the herd mentality chapter, about a particular school district that I went to visit. And again, my job was to get qualitative. I had the quantitative data. My job was to get the qualitative data, right? Like, okay, what's happening that is causing these numbers to look this way in student achievement? And there was a room full of women, and they were on a roll. They were talking about solutions and what they could do to support these students that weren't grasping these concepts. And then there was someone else that walked in the room who happened to be a man, right? And in a matter of seconds, the women who were like the most vocal, it was like you saw their body language change. They became like real quiet, and they started to ask him, well, this is the situation. What do you think we should do? Now, it could be climate and culture. It could be they knew that this administrator, operates a certain way. But I just thought it was interesting how all of the creativity that they were coming up with, that went out the window as soon as this person, who happened to be a man, walked into the room, right? So when you say like, well, what can we then do? We can then recognize in ourselves something just changed. Why? And I'm saying this because I do it often. Something just changed. My thought process and how I'm showing up just changed. Why? What is it that I'm believing in this situation, and what is it that I need to do differently? But I'm a little biased in that I've done a lot of research on biases, and so I am probably more inclined to ask myself, okay, what's going on in me, and how do I need to shift and manage this bias so that I am showing up authentically and making sure that I'm doing a good job.
So if someone can't get past, and we only got 3 minutes left, I told you
wow.
I was going to fly by, but if someone can't get past the idea of thinking of this as a bias, is it okay then if they think of it as, what else can I do to be a better teacher?
Absolutely.
I mean, isn't that what we're really talking about?
If it hurts you to think about biases, right? Number one, let's think about why that is, right? Right? What's going on in us that language is is concerning, then say it as a prejudice, right? Because in the definition of biases is a disproportionate prejudice against X, Y, and Z. And,
Prejudge, meaning prejudice.
Prejudge. Like I'm prejudging this situation based on my lived experiences and based on what I know. And then once again, giving yourself grace, right? That we all prejudge a situation.
And this is not attached to socioeconomics or race.
No.
It could be a factor.
Absolutely.
But biases do not equate to those two.
No.
Those two phrases.
No.
So that you could have an upscale school division, you could have an urban school division, you could have a rural school division, a suburban one. They could all still have.
And I'll give you a quick 30-second example. One of my former directors said, Dr. K, wherever you find 2 or 3 people, you can find an inequity, and you can find the biases that are causing the inequity. And I was like, whoa. And he was talking about a school district that was predominantly white school district, and they had severe academic achievement or equity gaps in their students in terms of how they were showing up in math and literacy and things of that nature. And part of the issue had nothing to do with race. Nothing. It had to do with history. It was a farming community. Some of the people out there owned the farm. Some of the people worked on the farms. And in that particular community, there was some issues with drug use and, people who knew this person from back in the day and knew this mother from back in the day. And so the biases were about, oh, I know your mother. I know your family. Your mother did this. And so now I'm going to treat you this. Exactly.
You're going to be that same
Had
way.
Nothing to do with race.
If people want to know more, how do they find your book?
Oh, you can purchase my book. It is on Solution Tree Press, Solution Tree, and it's also on Amazon, Beyond Implicit and Explicit Bias.
Okay. Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Dr. Claudine Kizart. And audience, I want to thank you for the privilege of your time this hour. Now, you can listen to this show again or share it with a friend by visiting our website, whro.org/anotherview. You can also find us on Spotify or wherever you go for your podcast listening pleasure. And we want to invite you to join us or with Another View live as we celebrate Juneteenth from both inside and outside of WHRO Public Media. Now, we're going to have a storyteller, food trucks, a historian who will share some little-known Black history facts, and so much more. So plan to come out to WHRO Public Media on June 19th, beginning at 11:30 a.m. The broadcast starts at noon. It's all free. Well, you have to buy your food if you decide to eat the food truck, but it's all free, but registration is encouraged. So please go to whro.org/events to sign up and join us. We hope to see you on the 19th. Next week on Another View, the Another View Roundtable with commentary on today's current events. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Thanks to audio engineer Victor Bowen for filling in for Jordan Christie as she enjoys her honeymoon. Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone, and let's get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.